Welcome to this lecture for Research Methods. Dr. Sam Fiala will be talking today about surveys and samples. Quick overview. In terms of surveys, the two different types of surveys we'll talk about, survey methods, will be interviews and questionnaires. We'll talk a little bit about creating good questionnaires. Then we'll talk about samples, and we'll talk primarily about the two major types of approaches to sampling: probability and non-probability sampling. Okay, for surveys, we're talking about two types: interviews and questionnaires. Interviews can be, in terms of the differences between unstructured and structured, one of the big things is the amount of training. Another way they differ is in terms of your ability to make comparisons across respondents. For unstructured interviews, it's more difficult to compare people's responses across interviews because you're not asking them the same thing. So some people will have addressed topics that other people didn't touch on very much, or possibly not at all. Whereas for a structured interview, if you're asking everybody the same questions, then it's much easier to make those comparisons. So really depends on what you're looking for. If you're really, I have no idea what's going on, I'm really in exploratory phase, unstructured is probably better. If you've got an idea and you're looking for, okay, is this the answer? Is this there? Is this what's happening? Yes or no? Then a structured interview is probably going to be a better fit. One type of interview that is particularly useful in research is a focus group. Right? This is where you're interviewing people instead of one at a time in a group setting. Two pretty much ways to do this. One would be where you get members of the focus group, usually a small number of people, 8 to 10 maybe, that have some shared characteristic or shared experience. So maybe you're interested in people's experience of their first year teaching kindergarten. So you'll recruit a bunch of first year kindergarten teachers and have them talk about, in a group, their experiences. Now, one of the nice things about doing it in a group rather than just one person at a time is that you may get more information that way, right? Because if you ask everybody in the group, if you ask people individually, okay, tell me what you struggle with the most as a teacher, right? They'll tell you maybe one thing. Even if you say, okay, tell me 3 things you struggle with, they'll tell you those 3 things. But there may be something that they don't think of if you talk to them individually. But if they hear somebody else answer, oh, I struggle with this, and they go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. Me too. Oh, no, that's my number 1. I said something else, but no, this is my number 1. What they said, I agree, right? So you may get some more collaborative communication in a focus group, and that's good in a lot of ways of uncovering more information and finding commonalities. But it can also be a bit of a drawback because one person's answers are influencing someone else's answers, which is something we try to stay away from in other types of research. We want kind of independence of observations, right? You do not have independence of observations in a focus group. They are very dependent. What somebody says will affect somebody else. So pluses and minuses in terms of that. Another way to go would be if you're not so much interested in a particular group or their experience, you're more interested, okay, what is the community, what do people in general think about this thing, about this issue, about this topic? In which case, you're probably going to strive to get a more... Okay, so in contrast to interviews, question 1 second. Interviews can be conducted face-to-face. They can be conducted over the phone. I think it's probably... So questionnaires, obviously one of the advantages, well, it's cheaper than interviews in terms of the labor cost and material cost as well. Another thing to think about with questionnaires is response rates. So interviews, if you interview 10 people, then you know you're getting data from 10 people. If you send out a questionnaire to 10 people, you don't know that you're getting a questionnaire back from 10 people. You may get a questionnaire back from 2 of those 10 or 3 of those 10, right? So depending on how relevant the questions are to the people you're sending it to and whether or not you're providing an incentive and a couple other kind of marketing things, you'll get a higher or lower response rate. If you get a really low response rate, that can be problematic, right? Because you start to wonder, okay, is there something different about the people who completed my survey and sent it back than those who didn't? It's kind of like faculty talk about with their class reviews when they do them online. They say, oh, it's only the students that love me and the students that hate me that fill it out. Everybody in the middle can't be bothered, right? So there's this kind of response bias when you have a low response rate. It's only people in the extremes that are responding. That could be a problem. Last thing we think about is okay, now let's talk about bad questions. And these are bad questions. Primarily, we'll talk about them in terms of questionnaires, but it also applies to interviews to some degree. With interviews, you can ask kind of worse questions, because if questions are confusing or you think they're being misleading, you can course correct. You can go, oh, I can see you're confused by what I'm saying. Let me clarify. Versus with a written questionnaire, you can't clarify. The question is what the question is. So you need to have good ones. So stay away from one type of bad question. An example would be, to what extent do you feel that spanking is appropriate and that timeout is ineffective? Stay away from double-barreled questions. Loaded. An example would be, what things that your professor does make you the most angry? Right? So this is assuming that something that the professor does makes them angry. And if nothing the professor does makes them angry, I don't really care what they do. It doesn't bother me. How do they answer that question? Well, they can't, because you've loaded the question with a preconceived notion, a presumption about them. Somewhat. So it might be, are you opposed to the slaughter of innocent animals for research that has no immediate application? Yeah, I guess that sounds bad the way you said it, right? But what if you worded it differently, said, okay, do you support research that can ultimately lead to breakthroughs that may save the lives of thousands of people if that research also involves the euthanasia of a small number of animals? Okay, well, you're sort of asking the same thing, but two very different ways. You're probably going to get very different responses from the same person depending on how you phrase it, right? So don't lead people in a direction. Try to ask questions as neutrally as possible, right? Put the question in the middle so that their feelings for or against can come out, and you don't just get confirmation of what you believe or what you're looking for, because that's not as valuable as the truth. The use of absolutes is something also to be careful about. Example would be, how true is it that you always help a friend? Be aware of the vocabulary level you're using and your use of jargon. Now, the vocabulary level you use and the amount of jargon you use are going to depend on what population you're surveying, right? If you have a survey going out to a bunch of people who are engineering students, well, you can use more engineering jargon than if you have one going out to the general population, right? So general population, stay away from professional jargon. And I'd say for the vocabulary level, you should be shooting at a 5th grade reading level, right? And this isn't assuming that the general population reads at a 5th grade level. The idea here is that we don't want to put an extra cognitive strain, a cognitive load on people completing our survey, where they're having to read questions 2 or 3 times. Wait, okay, what do they mean? I think that I know, but let me just read it one more time to make sure I know. Because that's going to slow them down. If it slows them down, well, now they become less likely to finish the survey, right? So we want it to be stated fairly simply so that most people in the general population can read it one time and go, okay, I know what they're asking. Here's my answer. I know exactly what they mean, right? So trying to be clear. So when you think about your questions, write it as if you can imagine a 5th grader were to read it. Would they understand what you're trying to ask? Some examples. To what extent do you have yeah, that's weird. That's a vague question if I leave some words out. To what extent do you have disagreements with your spouse regarding pecuniary obligations? A lot. No. What does pecuniary mean? Like, I don't know. So use words that a fifth grader would know. Pecuniary, not one of those words. In terms of jargon and language simple. Also, using, right? So, how true is it that you aren't able to not talk to an ex? If you think that's confusing, what do you think about, okay, if your responses are going to be something like, not at all true to very true. If it's not at all true, I say, okay, it's not at all true that I'm not able to not talk to an ex. Okay, now it's gone. Sorry about that. And be sensitive. Okay, a few more tips on questionnaire construction. Reversing items. So we've talked before about when you want to measure a construct, a conceptual variable, typically you don't want to do that with just one question. You want multiple questions, multiple items. Now, so if I'm measuring depression and I've got 10 questions asking about depression, I don't want them all worded where if you agree, so yeah, that's true of me, that agreeing to all of them means, yep, depressed, right? Because if somebody comes in with some sort of response set, acquiescence or naysaying, or they're just putting, sevens to everything or just ones to everything, I'm not going to know, wow, they're really depressed. Maybe, or they just put all sevens, right? Whereas if I reverse some of the items where, okay, answering 7 completely true of me on this question means you're very depressed. Answering 7 completely true of me on this question means you're not depressed at all, right? So how often do you find yourself crying in the morning? Oh, 7. How often do you find yourself laughing with joy throughout the day? 7. Wait, you're crying and laughing? Okay, then maybe something else. But again, those, if they're kind of incompatible, you shouldn't see people with all 7s for things that are reverse coded. And so that can help you identify people. If you have Likert items or Likert type items where you're saying, strongly agree, disagree, or very true, not at all true, just as not so much for the constructing the survey itself, but to help you down the road when you're analyzing the data, put the agree option toward the right, toward the higher number, toward like the 5 or the 7, and the disagree down at the 1, right? Because if we're trying to measure, okay, what are people's attitudes towards, building this school? And if they're saying, if you do it the other way, if you say, okay, 1 is agree, yes, this is a great idea, I agree, 1. You say, okay, the average response on questions about building the school was 1.4. There's lots of agreement. Well, lots of agreement, that's a small number, right? Doesn't make sense. It makes more sense for the bigger number to mean lots of agreement. Yes, lots of this characteristic. So just as a matter of interpreting your scale scores later on, it makes more sense to put the agree, the very true to the right, the disagree, the not all true on the left. In terms of providing good instructions, really important to help your survey perform the way you want it to. And the things you want to do, you want to emphasize anonymity. The other thing that's important is encouraging honesty, right? So trying to make clear to people that it's important that you answer honestly and forthrightly, and kind of try to communicate acceptance, no judgment. There are no right answers. This is just your opinions. Tell us about your experience. Everyone's experience is, unique. Try to validate people's ability to tell you things that they may be uncomfortable telling you, right? And that'll help reduce social desirability and self-promotion. Kind of related to that, in terms of identifying information, when you ask about demographics. If you ask a whole lot of very specific demographics in a survey, people are going to think, oh, this isn't anonymous. You know my age, my ethnicity, my major, and whether or not I have a disability. You're going to figure out who I am, right? So sometimes you want to ask questions in a way where it's less identifiable. One of the most common ones is age. Rather than to give a specific number, you provide them with age ranges, right? So 20 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, whatever it is, some interval that they can say, okay, I'm here. That way you can get an idea of where people are age-wise. Maybe you can't calculate an average age, and that may not be important to you. But that also kind of predicts their anonymity, makes it more likely they're going to be honest about the things you really care about, which probably age isn't your primary variable of interest, right? Keep in mind down the road when you're writing your questions, your data analysis, right? And by that I mean thinking about how you're going to phrase your questions. If you're going to ask open-ended questions, that's going to lead to kind of narrative responses. Okay, you can't get an average of that. You're going to have to do some qualitative analysis. If you ask any kind of narrative question, where you have, fill in the blank. Okay, you've got to go back and make some judgments of what that means to be able to report those data. If you're asking quantitative questions, where they're giving some number or picking, A or B, yes or no, true or false. Okay, now we can deal with some numbers. But if we make it dichotomous, where it's yes or no, that's true of me, that's not true of me, that's less variability to work with in terms of analyzing our data. Right? So typically I'd say there's not a compelling reason to ask a question with a kind of a dichotomous response set, default to giving people options that range between 5 and 7 responses, right? So if it's agree, disagree, true, not true, a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale is generally what you're shooting. Okay, moving on to sampling. When we talk about sampling, we're talking about getting a group of participants from some population. And when we measure things in a population, some characteristic, we get some number, if it's an average, a median, a mode, a frequency, whatever, that value is called a parameter. And when we talk about the population that we're measuring or estimating parameters, oftentimes people assume, oh, that means the population, that's everybody, everybody in the world, or at least everybody in America, well, kind of Western-centric ideals. But it's not. It's the population of interest. So what population are you interested in generalizing to, talking about, studying, looking at, okay, is this true for this group of people, right? And that could be, teenagers in America. Could be third graders in Texas. Could be graduate students at A&M Central Texas. Right? You specify the population of interest. So it's somewhat subjective. The researcher specifies what they're looking for. Okay, here's my population, and I'm not going to get everybody in the population. I can't afford to do that. I'm just going to get some of them, and the sum of them will be a sample. Right? So whenever you do calculate a statistic, typically, inherently, it's going to have, it won't be the same exact value, it won't be equal to the parameter it's trying to estimate. And that's because of sampling error. Now, sampling error isn't a mistake. You didn't do anything wrong. It's just due to random variability, when you measure a group of people that's part of a larger group, like the mean, the mode, whatever, that characteristic of the smaller group won't be exactly the same as the two basic types of sampling that we talk about. Probability sampling is one of them, and probability sampling is where obviously you know the probability of somebody being selected into a sample from the population, right? And this is super important when you're placing a lot of value on having a representative sample and a sample that can be used to make statements that are highly generalizable to the population, right? So this is whenever things like exit polls for elections, we're trying to say, okay, how's the country going to vote? And we get this sample of people. We want a very representative sample that's very generalizable, because we're trying to make something, okay, here's what's going to happen as prediction. So in that case, we probably want a probability sample. We want people in that sample to have an equal probability of being in there, every member of the population, right? But that's not always that important. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But when it's important, you want to go with probability sampling. But there's a higher cost to probability sampling when compared to non-probability sampling. And there are also some practical limitations. Right? So can you really get a sample using probability sampling? We'll talk more about that when we get to simple random sample in just a minute. And again, the other type being non-probability, where you don't know the probability of someone in the population being selected into the sample. Okay, in terms of probability sampling, talk about three types. One being simple random sampling. In simple random sampling, each person in a population of interest has an equal chance of being in the sample. So, if your population was everyone living in Bell County, Texas right now, that's not too bad. That's not America. That's not the world. Probably get that right. Okay. Now think practically. How are you going to get access to every person living in Bell County right now to be potentially selected into your sample? And right away you think, well, I guess, babies, probably not. Children, minors, that's probably difficult. Okay, well, my population is adults. Adults living in Bell County right now. Okay. What if they're not legal residents? Are you going to be able to get access to those people? What if they don't speak English? What if they're in jail or prison? What if they're in the hospital? What if they're in a coma? Right? What if they have some disability that prevents them from accessing a computer or reading the survey you're going to send to them or the interview you're going to conduct? Right? Can you really get to everybody? Does everybody really have an equal chance of being in your sample? Probably not, right? Even for just Bell County, which isn't that big compared to Texas, America, the world, right? Pretty challenging to get a simple random sample. You really need a specific group that's easily identifiable. So you could say maybe active members of Division 23 of the American Psychological Association. Okay, well, you've now specified active members, and that's already going to be just adults who are, psychologists. You've got this kind of small group, and the APA maintains a list of those people with contact information for them. So, yeah, it's more reasonable to think you could truly get a simple random sample from that population. But for many, many populations of interest, it would be impractical to get a simple random sample where somebody really did have, every person in the population had an equal chance of being in the sample. The other thing to keep in mind too, that to truly have simple random sampling, you should be doing sampling with replacement. So what that means is if you had this theoretical list of, let's say 300 psychologists who were a member of this organization, and you had their names in a hat, and you drew out a name, okay, this person is now in my sample. Most of us, you and I, and most people would say, okay, put that name to the side. They're already in my sample. Now draw another one. If you do that, okay, well, the second person, the third person, the fifth, sixth, the 10th person drawn, the more people you draw, each of those people has an increased chance of being selected compared to the earlier person because there's less names in the hat. You no longer have a simple random sample because people don't have an equal probability. So you have to draw a name and then put it back in the hat and potentially be drawn again, right? Which is kind of weird and counterintuitive. So simple random samples, theoretically important. Practically speaking, we don't see them too often, right? And as we'll see, they may not be that important for a lot of things we really want to do. Another way to kind of get a sort of random sample is stratified random sampling. So this is where you identify, so you randomly sample from each strata, and you can do it two ways. You can have proportionate stratified random sampling, or subsets or clusters of a population, and then possibly subsets of those subsets, and on down the line until ultimately you're going to be randomly selecting participants from within selected clusters or subsets. Okay. So to make it a little more clear, imagine you want a sample of adults in the U.S. Right? Oh, that's too big. I can't get everybody in the U.S. So say, well, first I'll break the U.S. into clusters. You know, the Northwest, the Northeast, the Southwest, and the Southeast. And I will randomly select one of those 4 clusters. Or maybe I'll select 2 of those 4 clusters. I'm going to narrow it down some. And then within those clusters, okay, maybe I did 2. I got the Northeast and the Northwest randomly. Okay, now I'm going to randomly select 3 states within both of those clusters. Okay, and then within those 6 states, 3 in each, I'm going to randomly select, 2 counties or 3 counties. And on down the line until, okay, within those counties, now I'm going to randomly select my participants. That would be cluster sampling. So you're trying to be random. You'd like to be simple random sampling, but you realize it's impractical. So try to keep as much randomness as you can using this kind of clustering approach. So as I said, randomly selecting participants from within the clusters at the end. Okay. In contrast to those probability sampling methods is non-probability sampling, with the most common type of non-probability sampling being convenience sampling, where you get a convenient sample. So just the people who are available to you, right? So you don't know the probability that people in the population would be selected into your sample. It's unknown and you don't really care. You just, you sent out some flyers, you recruited in an area, you put an ad on TV, some people showed up to take your survey, and that's your sample. It was convenient, it was easy. Yeah. Another thing to think about in terms of, well, should I really try to use probability sampling, or will convenience sampling be okay? The question you're trying to answer. Are you trying to answer, can some therapy, some pill, some intervention have an effect? Or are you asking, hey, does this intervention, this therapy, this pill have an effect out in the world? Now, if you're saying, can it have an effect? Well, I don't need a representative sample to know if something can work. I just need some people that are real people. Hey, work with these people. Well, these people are different. They're super smart, or they're super fast, or they're super attractive, whatever it is. They're different than the rest of the population. Yeah, but it worked for them. It can work. Maybe it work for others. Now, will it work for everybody? I don't know, because I got this weird non-representative group. But I know it can work. Now, if that's what you're at in kind of the early stages of research, then you're good. You don't really care. Now, if you've done that work and you want to know, okay, well, it can work. Does it work? And does it work with everybody? Well, if you want to know if it works with everybody, well then yeah, now you need a more representative sample. But again, I would argue, don't try to do that in a single study. Do that with multiple studies. Don't ever try to do a study that says, will this work for everybody? Say, will it work for this group? Somebody says, hey, what about this group? I don't know. Let me do another study and find out, right? Look at these kind of groups. If it's age, gender, ethnicity, education, income, whatever, look at them individually, because you can focus in on if it works for them or not, and if it doesn't, you can figure out why, right? So quota sampling is sort of like the convenience version of random stratified sampling. So your convenience sampling within strata. So you want to make sure you have maybe equal numbers of men and women, or proportionate numbers of men and women, but you're not going to randomly sample. You're just going to use your convenience sample to do that. So you're still making those strata. Okay, I'll make sure I'm going to get 30% of this group, 40% of this group, and 20% of that group. Good to go. I'm just not doing it with random sampling. I'm doing it with convenience sampling, trying to get a quota. I'm going to keep recruiting for that group until I get everybody. If people come for a group I've got everybody for, I say, hey, thanks for your interest, but we're good. Basically, tell a friend sample. So this is a method that's helpful for if you're trying to study small or hard to find populations, maybe vulnerable populations. If you're in terms of recruiting a sample, using incentives can be effective. Things like complete this questionnaire, this survey, you'll be entered into a drawing to win some prize. And again, depending on what you're asking people to do, you got to think about, okay, you don't want to offer too big a prize, especially if you're going to expose people to discomfort, because that can be an ethical violation. And there's some questions you're going to ask that people will be interested in answering, and so you may not even need an incentive, or incentives will be less important. But I can tell you they can be effective, and they don't even have to be big. Sometimes, if you kind of read the literature on cognitive dissonance, it may be more effective to give a small incentive, right? Because we give a small incentive, then it's not so much that people feel like they're being bought, but it's enough to kind of make them feel a little bit guilty. But yeah, I'm going to do this. I'm not doing it because you gave me $1, because $1 is nothing. I'm doing it because I want to. And giving people $1 to complete a survey, if you give them $1 before they do it, does increase your response rate. I've got data on that. Another thing, in terms of first contact with participants to try to recruit them, most common ways to do it would be posting flyers, right? On that flyer, you can either put, phone number, email, hey, if you're interested, call, email, or a link, or, for a lot of surveys, you can develop a QR code where they can then scan it with their phone, and it'll take them directly to your questionnaire, your survey. You can also do it in person, right? That walking through a college campus or a library saying, hey, will you fill out my survey? And again, you could be passing out the survey, or you could be passing out a piece of paper that has a link or a QR code, whatever it is, which again, you're using some social pressure to get people to do it, which may give you a little bit higher response rate than those more anonymous approaches. And think too about where you could go in person to get people to fill out surveys. Go places where people are going to be kind of bored and have nothing to do. So the DMV, or maybe the bank on a Saturday when they're waiting in line. I got nothing else to do. The doctor's office. Maybe stay from those if you don't want to get sick. But you gotta think creatively about where you could recruit a sample for a population that you're interested in. Unfortunately, one of the biggest sources of samples for behavioral science research is the captive audience that we refer to as students, and in particular students in psychology classes, right? Where they're either given course credit for participating in research, or there's some sort of departmental requirement to participate in research. And that's great in terms of getting us lots of data and access to data. But to the extent that our knowledge of the human mind is built on studies of psychology majors and college students in general, well, that may be a skewed or a biased view of the human mind, of human behavior. So it's important to be mindful of that, especially when you're doing research that isn't just looking at, can something happen, when you're looking at more of those things where you want to represent an example, where you want to be able to generalize to a larger population than just college students. Okay, how big a sample you need? Again, we talked before about there's a point of diminishing returns in terms of decreasing sampling error and having an accurate estimate of parameters. But the other thing to think about in terms of how big is in terms of power, the power to find statistically significant effects or relationships, right? And that's kind of a statistical term. How big a sample do you need to have sufficient power? Well, that depends on a couple things. It depends on how big an effect or how big of a relationship you're looking for. Right? If I think, okay, this thing causes a difference, but it's a small little difference, I'm going to need a really big sample. If I think, okay, whenever this therapy, it's going to make people so happy, it's going to have such a huge effect, okay, I can find that with a smaller sample. Right? So the size of the effect, size of the difference will play a role in how big a sample you need. How much variability there is on the variable that you're measuring, that will also have an impact. But in terms of giving you a number, kind of a general rule is about 20 to 25 participants per variable that you're interested in looking at. But it's not a straight linear function, and there's actual fairly complex power analyses you can do to figure out for different types of analysis how big a sample you need to have sufficient power. Okay, last thing in terms of sampling bias, it can creep in a couple of ways. And again, sampling bias isn't about sampling bias can come in a couple of ways. It can come from your recruitment message. It can also come from the participant pool. So in terms of your recruit message, let's say you're looking to do a study of a smoking cessation program, right? And you have these flyers, and your flyers say, "Are you ready to finally kick the habit? Have you decided it's time to make a change in your life? Sign up for this study study of a smoking cessation program that will help you quit." Okay, well, who's going to participate in your study? People that are ready to quit, because that's who you're marketing to, right? And people that are ready to quit are more likely to quit. So when you find, hey, everyone in my sample quit smoking, does that mean your program worked? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they were just ready, right? Think about the trans-theoretical model of change. Well, they were in the action stage. They were ready to go. Didn't really matter what my program was. They had made a commitment to stop smoking at that point. And I could have just said, okay, stare at the wall for 10 minutes, and it would have also shown to be an effective program. Right? So how you recruit people and the message you give may lead to different types of people coming in, and that can impact your results. You end up having a bias sample, people that are different in some important way on the dependent variable. The other thing is where you're getting people from, your participant pool. Right? So if I'm interested in I'm interested in the sexual behaviors of singles, and I'm putting up flyers in all the local bars in town, like downtown, I'm going to get a particular group of singles. I'm not going to get those singles who aren't going to bars, who are looking to meet people in other ways. So when I measure their kind of attitudes towards sexual behavior, that may be different. There'll be something unique about that group, right? So they're different than the population I'm trying to get on the dependent variable in some sort of way, and that's sampling bias. Again, not sampling error. Sampling error is random. This is non-random. This is where you have some sort of systematic, something's different about these folks. Okay, take-home message. Survey construction, how you're building interviews, interview questions, questionnaires, has a direct impact on construct validity. Now again, construct validity is all about the degree to which we are measuring what we intend to measure. The truth, the validity is the truth of our measurement. So if you have kind of bad questions, double-barreled questions, leading questions, loaded questions, vague questions, then you've got error creeping into your measurement, and you may not be measuring what you intend to measure. And if you're not measuring what you intend to measure, then what do your findings even mean? You have no idea. And again, this is relevant for descriptive research, where we're looking at, okay, what's going on with these people? What are their opinions? who's doing what, how much are they doing, and I don't have hypotheses about what they're doing. I just want to know what's going on. I still need to be able to measure things well. But then it has an even greater importance, I would argue, for research where you're doing hypothesis testing, your correlation research, your experimental research. We're looking at, okay, is there an effect of this independent variable and this dependent variable? Is there a relationship between this predictor and this criterion? Well, those variables, we have operational definitions of them. Here's what we're saying it is. It's this construct we're trying to measure. Well, did you really measure it with this questionnaire? When you said you were measuring self-esteem with the self-esteem questionnaire, did you really measure self-esteem? To what degree did you truly measure it? If you did, then you've got good construct validity, and now we can talk about what your findings mean. If you didn't, I don't know what to tell you. You're done. The boat's sunk, right? So survey construction, hugely important. Sample recruitment and composition, also important in terms of obviously impacting external validity, generalizability. So when we find some truth within a study, how far external, outside of the study, can that truth spread? Okay, this thing had an effect on these people at this time using this measure. What about if the people were different? Because all the people in my study were all in Texas. What about people in Wyoming? All the people in my study were right-handed. What about left-handed people? Right? So how far outside of my sample, outside of my study, outside of what they did, does the truth spread? Does it go? And obviously, the more representative your sample is of a population of interest, the more external validity you have. And again, external validity is important. It's good, but it isn't necessarily the end-all, be-all. If I don't have high external validity, my study is worthless. Not necessarily, right? You may have limited external validity. You need to be able to acknowledge that, right? And if you're reading studies, this study has limited external validity. Hey, they found this treatment works really well for these veterans. That they did this study for all these people that were in, the Air Force. Air Force, I don't know. Will it work with Marines? I don't know. Do another study and find out, right? Doesn't mean that it's a bad study. It means, oh, hey, they found something that worked for this group. And to the degree that that group is similar to this other group, it might also work. If you think those groups are very different, and they're different in such a way that the thing shouldn't work, okay, maybe do research and find out. What's probably more important is that sample recruitment and composition can also impact internal validity. Internal validity. Internal validity being the truth within the study. So within the study, did we really find this cause and effect? Did A cause B? We said that these two things are related. Are they really related, or was it just chance covariation, right? So if I'm stacking the deck with a biased sample, right, where this sample, there's something different about them, and they're different in a particular way that's related to the dependent variable, again, where it'll make it look like my treatment, my intervention had an effect when it didn't, that's an even bigger problem, because now I'm not even worried about spreading the truth externally, because internally the truth is questionable. It may not be valid. So overall, pay attention to survey construction when building your own, when reading other people's stuff. See how they did that. Is the instrument good? Does it have good psychometric properties? Did they do the things you're supposed to do? Are the questions worded in a way that it should give you meaningful data? And then look at how people are recruiting their sample. Not just, oh yeah, they had this many men, this many women. That's cool. Where did they get their sample from? How did they convince people to be in their study? Those things might impact the types of answers people are going to give, and might impact the conclusions you can draw from a study. Okay, that's all for now. Take care.